The Caldwell family arrives in the quiet town of Ravenwood, hoping to start over after tragedy. But some things won't be as welcoming. The moving truck hissed gently as its engine idled along the curb of Maple Lane, its cargo still half loaded with what little remained of the Caldwells' old life. Autumn leaves skittered across the sidewalk in swirling clumps, the trees above glowing in shades of copper and flame. Ethan Caldwell stood on the front porch of their new home, sleeves rolled up, watching as his daughter Lila wheeled herself down the moving ramp with careful precision. She was focused, determined not to let the small bump at the top edge of the truck slow her down. Ethan kept close without hovering, hands ready, just in case. He knew better than to fuss. Lila hated that. She didn't say much these days, not since the accident. But her silence wasn't emptiness. It was a field of quiet thoughts she protected fiercely. "Looks like we beat the leaf trucks," Ethan said, attempting lightness as he stepped past her with a box labeled linens. Lila gave a small smile. "They crunch louder here. I like it." Inside, the house was modest, a single-story ranch with wide doorways and hardwood floors, the kind of place where you could breathe a little easier. As Ethan unpacked a box marked "Office Do Not Toss," something metallic slipped from a manila folder and clinked softly against the floor. He bent to pick it up. A badge, his old courtroom identification. Judge Ethan Caldwell, etched in brass, still gleamed beneath the dust. He stared at it a moment, then slipped it back into the folder labeled "Retired Cases," sliding the box under the hallway table, out of view. That life was behind him. This house, this town, was meant to be about Lila now. By mid-morning, Ethan had installed the ramp, a modest sanded wood design with side rails and rubber footing. Nothing extravagant, nothing that should draw attention. Lila tested it a few times, navigating from the porch to the gravel driveway and back with practiced confidence. Her hands gripped the wheels steadily, chin slightly raised, eyes taking in the neighborhood as if scanning for a verdict. Across the street, an older woman, in a wool shawl, waved gently from her porch swing. She held a copy of the local paper, its pages fluttering in the breeze, and beside her sat a small tray with cornbread muffins and a mason jar of apple jelly. "Morning," she called, voice warm. "You two must be the Caldwells. I'm Edna Jacobs. Lived here 38 years. Baked too much again? Please tell me you like cornbread." Ethan smiled. "We do, thank you, ma'am." Mrs. Jacobs rose carefully, balancing her cane in the plate. "I'll drop these off before lunch. Welcome to the neighborhood. Watch out for Cheryl." "Cheryl?" Ethan asked. Mrs. Jacobs just smiled a knowing smile and shuffled back to her porch. Later that afternoon, as Ethan tightened the last bolts on the ramp, a Navy sedan pulled into the drive across the street. Out stepped a tall woman in a fitted wool coat, heels clacking against the brick walkway. Her blonde bob was pristine, her posture military. She crossed the street with a brochure in hand and a folded paper clipped to the front. "You must be Mr. Caldwell," she said, extending a hand with the precision of someone used to being obeyed. "I'm Cheryl Donahue, president of the Ravenwood Homeowners Association." "Pleasure," Ethan replied, shaking her hand. "I saw the ramp," she said with a practiced smile. "Functional design. Of course, our community values visual consistency. Our guidelines suggest pre-approval for all structural changes, visible or otherwise." "It's a safety necessity," Ethan said. "For my daughter." Cheryl glanced past him toward Lila, who was quietly sketching in a notebook under the porch eave. Her gaze lingered a second too long. "Of course, we support families of all kinds. Just be sure to consult our handbook. We've worked hard to keep Ravenwood beautiful." She handed him the brochure. On its glossy cover, smiling neighbors waved in front of spotless lawns. Ethan thanked her. Cheryl returned to her car, heels clicking all the way. Ethan stood there a while, the late afternoon sun casting long golden beams across the porch. Lila looked up. "She didn't like it, did she?" "She'll get used to it," Ethan replied. That evening, as the house grew quiet and boxes began to form neat piles in corners, a soft knock came at the door. No one was there, but a rolled packet had been left on the welcome mat. Ethan picked it up. A sticky note was affixed to the front. "See page 6, Exterior Modifications." Ethan read the page, eyes narrowing. "So it begins," he says under his breath. A violation letter arrives with a $500 fine for unapproved external structure. The envelope was crisp, official-looking, with the HOA logo embossed at the top, an oak tree ringed by stars. Ethan found it tucked under the front doormat on a Tuesday morning, barely visible beneath a small stack of real estate flyers. The temperature had dropped overnight, and his breath formed light puffs as he bent to retrieve the mail. Inside, the letter was polite but firm. Notice of fine, unapproved exterior modification. Amount due, $500. Immediate remediation requested to preserve visual cohesion. Ethan read it twice, then again, his jaw tightening with each pass. Below the statement, in smaller print, appeals must be submitted in writing within 5 business days. He stood still for a moment, the crisp paper rustling slightly in his hand. From inside the house, Lila's voice called out, "Did we get anything fun?" He folded the letter. "Just bills." Later that morning, over toast and eggs, Lila stirred her juice with a straw, staring out the window. The ramp, bathed in amber light, looked peaceful, like it belonged there. She said softly, "At my old school, ramps were everywhere, and no one called them ugly." Ethan didn't answer right away. He reached for his coffee and held it for warmth, watching the steam swirl like thoughts he hadn't said aloud. By 10 o'clock, he was standing inside the Ravenwood HOA office, a narrow brick building attached to the back of the community clubhouse. Cheryl sat at a polished desk beneath a landscape print of a pristine suburban street. Ethan handed her a folder containing Lila's ADA certification and a typed letter citing federal protections. She skimmed the documents with a clinical glance, then pushed them back toward him. "This isn't about disability, it's about harmony," she said, as if reciting from a script. "We simply ask that residents respect the aesthetics we've all agreed to maintain." "I wasn't aware that ramps threatened harmony," Ethan replied evenly. Cheryl smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's about precedent. We've had some, let's say, creative modifications in the past. We just can't start making exceptions." "So federal law is an exception now?" She didn't respond. Instead, she opened a drawer and withdrew a stapled packet. "This is a proposed rule revision we're presenting to the board this weekend. No structural additions visible from street without prior HOA approval." Simple. Objective Ethan didn't take the packet. "This ramp is staying." "Of course, you're entitled to your opinion," she said smoothly. "Just remember, it's not only about rules, it's about how the community perceives compliance." Outside, the day had brightened, but Ethan felt the cold more sharply. On his way home, he passed Tom and Nancy Grover, 2 houses down, raking leaves in quiet tandem. They waved, hesitant, polite. He nodded back, not slowing. At home, Lila wasn't in the living room where he'd left her. Her school tablet still sat on the table, untouched. He found her in her room, curled in the window seat with a blanket draped across her lap, staring out at the street. "I didn't feel like going today," she said before he could ask. "Are you sick?" "No," she murmured. "Just tired. Tired of being watched." That evening, a folded newsletter appeared in the mailbox, printed in bright fall colors. Along with notices of a neighborhood chili cook-off and best autumn porch contest, there was a section titled Compliance Monitoring Updates. The Caldwell home was listed as pending compliance review, exterior variance under evaluation. Lila was the one who pulled it from the box. She read the line twice, her mouth pressed into a flat line, then handed the paper silently to Ethan. After dinner, Mrs. Jacobs stopped by with a loaf of pumpkin bread and her grandson, Ben. The boy was maybe 11, thin and eager, wearing a sweatshirt 2 sizes too big and sneakers that squeaked. "Hi," he said to Lila, eyes scanning her wheelchair before quickly darting back up. "Cool sketchbook." "Thanks," she replied. "Do you draw superheroes?" "Sometimes," she said, a flicker of interest lighting her expression. "Can I see?" She hesitated, then flipped the book open to a pencil drawing of a cat with wings. Ben grinned. "That's awesome." It was the first real smile Ethan had seen from her all week. As dusk settled over Ravenwood, porch lights flicked on in soft oranges and pale yellows. Decorative wreaths adorned most doors. Scarecrows posted guard beside tidy flower beds. The Caldwell ramp, in contrast, sat plain and necessary. Just before bed, Ethan walked the perimeter of the yard, checking for any new notices. There were none. He turned back toward the porch, the chill working its way through his coat. He stepped inside quietly. The lights were off. Lila sat in her wheelchair near the window, her arms folded across her lap, her eyes fixed on the ramp. "Do I make them uncomfortable?" she asked. A new security camera appears overnight, facing the Caldwell driveway. Ethan noticed it as he stepped out to retrieve the morning paper, a thin sheet of frost crunching under his boots. It was mounted discreetly on a neighboring gutter, its black lens angled downward, a silent observer perched like a crow. He stared at it for a moment, his breath hanging in the cold air, then continued down the walkway without a word. Inside, the house was quieter than usual. Lila hadn't come out of her room yet. The blinds remained drawn, as they had for days, blocking the view of passers-by, and of that camera. The decorations along the street had grown more elaborate, artificial pumpkins in perfect symmetry, flickering LED candles in window boxes, polished brass plaques with names carved into faux harvest leaves. Ravenwood had crossed from festive into performative. In the kitchen drawer, while searching for a roll of tape, Ethan's fingers brushed against a small, scuffed USB drive. He pulled it out, recognizing his own handwriting across the side in faded ink. Harrison v. Oakgate, HOA. His thumb hovered over the metal cap. For a second, he almost plugged it in. But instead, he set it aside and returned to the drawer for tape, closing it with a quiet click. Later that afternoon, a soft knock interrupted the silence. When Ethan opened the door, Cheryl stood there in a camel-colored coat, holding a clipboard with practiced ease. Behind her, the security camera loomed in the background like punctuation. "We're following up," she said without greeting. "It's been 7 days since your first notice. No appeal has been filed." Ethan folded his arms. "Federal law allows 30? "Our HOA regulations are more streamlined," she replied. "Efficient. We're simply informing you that a lien may be assessed if the matter remains unresolved." "This ramp is not being removed." Cheryl's smile flickered. "I see." She adjusted her scarf. "I do hope you understand. It's not personal. It's about preserving the value of everyone's investment." "Funny," Ethan said quietly. "It feels personal." As she turned to leave, Cheryl paused. "Most people find that fitting in leads to a smoother experience here." From the top of the stairs, Lila watched through a narrow gap in the blinds. That evening, Mrs. Jacobs appeared on their porch, holding a plate of cookies wrapped in wax paper. Beside her was Ben, who bounced on the balls of his feet, hands stuffed into the pockets of a faded hoodie. "We baked too many," Mrs. Jacobs said, her smile sincere. Ben waved at Lila. "I've got wheels too," he said, gesturing to his skateboard. Mine just go faster." Lila smirked. "Mine turn better." Mrs. Jacobs handed her the plate. "Come by tomorrow if you're up for it. I'll be making hot cocoa, real kind, with a stove." Lila's shoulders dropped slightly. "Okay." It was the most natural word she'd spoken all week. After they left, Ethan stood on the porch with the cookies untouched in his hands, watching the wind shake loose the last of the leaves. He glanced again at the camera across the street, then reached into his jacket and pulled out a small black recorder. Carefully, he secured it under the edge of the porch railing, tucked just between a loose board and the siding. He flipped the switch and stepped back. Inside, he opened his laptop and began browsing the local HOA forums and neighborhood discussion boards. Most posts were harmless: lost cat alerts, mulch sales, calls for volunteers at the bake sale. But one caught his eye. It had been posted that morning. Emergency HO meeting, Saturday 3 p.m. Topic: Community Standards, Enforcement, Update. No mention of location, no details, no invitation, nothing posted to his mailbox or inbox. He refreshed the page twice. Nothing changed. The next morning brought another envelope, this one hand-delivered and unsigned. Inside was a second violation letter. This time the fine had doubled and the language was sharper. Failure to comply may result in legal escalation. HOA reserves the right to act in the community's best interest. Ethan tucked it into the folder alongside the first. He glanced again at the USB drive still sitting where he'd left it. Not yet. Lila spent part of the afternoon in the Jacobs kitchen, her laughter faint but unmistakable through the open window. Ben had challenged her to a drawing contest, superheroes with ridiculous powers. She was happier there than he'd seen her in weeks. But as dusk fell and the porch light flicked on, the weight of the house returned. Ethan stood in the kitchen, staring out the window. He could hear faint murmurs outside, voices gathering across the street, where Cheryl's home glowed with warm light and hushed conversation. He waited until the house was silent, until Lila had gone to bed and the neighborhood had settled under the early cover of night. Then he opened his laptop, took a steady breath, and reached for the USB. It slid into the port with a quiet click. The screen blinked once, twice, then loaded a single folder. Unconstitutional enforcement patterns. He stared at it for a long moment, the cursor hovering. Then he clicked it open. "Time to remember who I am," he murmured. Ethan stands outside the HOA clubhouse, audio recorder in hand, listening to the voices behind closed doors. The November wind scraped down the sidewalk, sending a swirl of dry oak leaves around Ethan's boots as he stood in the shadow of the Ravenwood clubhouse. Light glowed faintly through the frosted windows, flickering as the inside hallway filled with movement and muffled voices. The clubhouse smelled faintly of old coffee and polished vinyl, the kind of scent etched into every HOA building across small-town America. Ethan stood near the far wall, away from the main entrance, holding a small recorder in his gloved palm. It was tucked discreetly into the lining of his jacket, the tiny mic just peeking through the zipper seam. He tilted his head slightly, catching fragments of conversation that rose and fell through the closed door. Unapproved structure visible from the main road. Sets the wrong tone for the neighborhood. Precedent for all sorts of changes. He narrowed his eyes, steadying his breath. A gust rattled the clubhouse flagpole, its metal clips clinking in the cold. Inside, Cheryl Donahue presided over the folding table like a judge at a tribunal. Her voice rang crisp and certain, punctuated by the quiet shifting of plastic chairs and the occasional cough. A thermos of coffee stood near her elbow, flanked by a paper plate of store-bought oatmeal cookies no one had touched. "We must think of the broader implications," she said, her tone measured. "If we allow one deviation from the standards, we invite dozens. Then what? Unpainted fences? Inflatable Santas year-round? Cars parked on lawns? We worked too hard to build this place. A board member, a balding man with a maroon sweater vest, cleared his throat. But Cheryl, the ramp is temporary, it's not even painted, and it's for a child. Cheryl didn't miss a beat. It's visible, that's the point. It disrupts the visual continuity. It broadcasts a certain disorder. She tapped the table with a nail. Do we want potential buyers to see nonconformity the moment they turn onto Maple Lane? Ethan exhaled slowly, remembering Lila's words from days ago. They don't hate the ramp, Dad. They hate needing to look at it. Inside, the conversation thickened. There's also the matter of neighborhood harmony, Cheryl continued. Some residents have expressed discomfort. They feel pressured, guilted, into acceptance. That's not a valid reason to classify something as a nuisance, the same board member muttered. Perhaps not in court, Cheryl snapped, but this isn't a courtroom. It's our home. There was a pause. Then came the vote. All in favor of amending the nuisance ordinance to include non-standard structures not pre-approved? A murmur of aye responses echoed. Opposed? Silence. Motion passed. Ethan clenched his jaw. The recorder captured every word. He waited a beat longer, allowing the conversation to drift toward committee updates and holiday schedules, before stepping away from the wall. He moved quickly down the sidewalk, the clubhouse doors still shut behind him, his breath now short from something deeper than the cold. At the corner, under the amber light of a street lamp, he took out his phone and made a call. Neil, it's Ethan. I have what we need. Get the ADA filings ready. He didn't wait for a full response, just a quiet affirmation on the other end. Back at his truck, the windshield was fogged with condensation. As he reached for the door handle, a flicker of movement caught his eye. A small envelope, white and plain, had been wedged beneath the driver's side wiper. No name, no return address. He slid it free, heart already anticipating the contents. His fingers trembled slightly, not with fear, but with clarity. Inside, a single sheet of paper. At the top, revised HOA Standards Draft. Internal notes. A yellow highlighter circled one line halfway down. Page 3, discussion of perceived visual burdens. At the bottom, in rushed handwriting, you didn't hear this from me? The HOA assistant slips an envelope under his windshield. Check page 3. As the HOA representative pins a lien notice to Ethan's front door, neighbors begin to gather, phones in hand. The hammering of the notice echoed louder than it should have, sharp and final in the brittle Saturday morning air. Frost clung to the grass like a thin layer of ice over something older and colder underneath. Cheryl stood with one hand braced against the front siding of the Caldwell home, her other holding the nail steady as she gave it a last firm strike. Beside her, Officer Jim Lawson shifted uncomfortably, watching the scene with the weariness of someone who already sensed he'd been dragged into something bigger than it appeared. Ethan opened the door before she could step away. She turned, clipboard in hand. We attempted multiple warnings, Mr. Caldwell. As of this morning, the HOA board has approved lien proceedings. We're simply here to formalize the process. Behind her, several neighbors had gathered, drawn by the noise, or perhaps by the email Cheryl had sent the night before. Some held their phones up, recording silently. Others stood with crossed arms, their breath visible in the cold, watching as if unsure whose side they were supposed to be on. Ethan stood in the doorway, wearing his wool coat, calm and unmoving. In his right hand, he held a briefcase. From the living room window, Lila peeked out through the curtains, her eyes just above the frame. Ethan didn't need to turn to know she was watching. He could feel the stillness behind him, hear the echo of what she'd whispered the night before. Are you still going to pretend you're just a dad? He stepped outside, pulling the door gently shut behind him. "Officer Lawson," he said evenly. "Has any part of this been filed through local code enforcement, or are you acting solely on the HOA's directive?" Lawson hesitated. "I was asked to be present to ensure civility. That's all." "Good," Ethan said, walking down the steps with the deliberate ease of a man reclaiming a role he never meant to revisit. He stopped beside Cheryl and opened his briefcase. Inside was a slim folder, the top page bold and clear. Americans with Disabilities Act. Enforcement Notice of Violation. He handed it to Cheryl without ceremony. "What you're doing violates multiple federal statutes, specifically Section 12,182 of the ADA, which prohibits discrimination in public accommodations, including community associations. Your attempt to penalize a legal, medically necessary ramp is not only unlawful, it's actionable." Cheryl opened the folder, blinked at the page, then looked up with a forced smile. "Let's not be dramatic, Mr. Caldwell." "Actually," he said, voice cool, "it's Judge Caldwell. U.S. District Court, retired. And this," he reached into the inside pocket of his coat and withdrew the audio recorder, "is the part where you should probably stop talking." He pressed play. The audio spilled into the chilly morning. Cheryl's voice, clear and unmistakable, echoing from the recorder with chilling precision. "It disrupts the visual continuity. It broadcasts a certain disorder. We can't have potential buyers seeing nonconformity the moment they turn onto Maple Lane." A murmur rippled through the small crowd. Mrs. Jacobs gasped softly. Mr. Nguyen's jaw tightened. One man near the curb, an older resident in a Ravenwood Golf Club cap, raised his phone higher, nodding solemnly as he filmed. Cheryl stepped back. "You can't just—" "I can," Ethan said. "And I am." Officer Lawson shifted his stance. "Ms. Donahue," he said cautiously, "this might be a good time to take a step back." "You don't understand," Cheryl said, voice rising. "I've worked for years to maintain this neighborhood's—" "This neighborhood's what?" Ethan asked quietly. "Image? Comfort? Conformity? Because that's not your job, and it's certainly not your right." The street had gone still. A few more neighbors had joined, some in slippers, others holding mugs of coffee, the kind of casual weekend chaos that usually marked garage sales or holiday decorating. But no one was smiling. No one spoke. "This ramp is staying," Ethan said. "And as of this morning, I've filed for a federal injunction against any further HOA action regarding my property or my daughter's medical accommodations. Civil rights lawsuits are being prepared, and every board member who voted in favor of this so-called nuisance regulation should consider seeking independent counsel." Cheryl looked around for support, but none came. Even the HOA assistant, standing off to the side with a folder in hand, didn't meet her eyes. Officer Lawson cleared his throat. "We won't be enforcing anything further today," he said. "Not without proper review." Ethan gave him a respectful nod. The silence lingered for a beat longer, until the crowd began to shift. Some neighbors backed away slowly. A few turned and walked off in small pairs. Only a handful remained. Then, quietly, Mrs. Jacobs stepped forward. Her scarf was tucked tightly around her neck, her cane planted firmly into the concrete. "She fined me for flying my husband's Navy flag," she said, voice trembling with something deeper than age. "I thought I was alone." Thanksgiving morning. Lila rolls down the ramp as neighbors hang garlands and wave. A handmade sign reads, "We're thankful for Lila." The sky was the color of polished steel, soft and expectant, with a gentle breeze carrying the smell of cinnamon and roasted turkey through the Ravenwood streets. Wreaths wrapped in plaid ribbons hung from mailboxes, and folding tables lined the sidewalks, already filling with pumpkin pies, steaming casseroles, and warm cider in ladled bowls. Lila wheeled down the ramp slowly, her scarf fluttering behind her, a grin lighting up her whole face as Ben trailed beside her holding a tangle of fake holly. On the railing, someone had taped a sign made of construction paper and glitter glue. The handwriting was uneven, but bold. "We're thankful for Lila." Across the street, Mrs. Jacobs stood beside a table of candied yams, waving with one hand, a thermos of cider in the other. Mr. Nguyen, wearing a heavy flannel and wool cap, was stringing white lights between two trees. When he saw Lila, he gave her a thumbs up and a wink. Inside the Caldwell home, Ethan stirred cranberry sauce over the stove, a wooden spoon moving in slow circles as the berries hissed and popped. He could hear Ben's voice outside, chattering excitedly about the porch decorations and his master plan to outdo every house on the block next year. Ethan smiled to himself and leaned briefly against the counter, eyes drifting to the window where garlands fluttered and children raced back and forth with paper turkeys and pies wrapped in foil. For the first time in months, the house felt lived in. By midday, the porch was fully decorated, pine cones, ribbons, even a string of Lila's sketches laminated and clipped along the railing. Families drifted toward the Caldwell yard, where a long photo banner hung from the porch posts. It read, "Freedom rises, here." Officer Lawson stopped by with a covered pie dish and a sheepish smile. "From my wife, she said to tell you it's bourbon pecan, and she swears it's legal." Ethan chuckled and took the dish. "Tell her she just earned a place in my Thanksgiving rotation." "You've earned a lot more than pie," Lawson said, glancing out at the crowd. "You shifted the whole tide around here." Ethan shrugged. "It wasn't just me." Ben climbed the porch steps and handed something to Lila, an 8x11 drawing done in colored pencil. It showed the ramp, her wheelchair, him on a skateboard, and a burst of fireworks overhead. At the bottom, he'd written, "Lila plus Ben equals brave." She blinked fast, then hugged him. "This is going on the fridge, forever." Not far off, a new couple introduced themselves to Mr. Nguyen, while two teenage girls asked Mrs. Jacobs if they could help her carry chairs from her garage. People were talking, really talking, and for the first time in a long while, there was laughter that didn't feel guarded. Near the cider station, a few old board members stood quietly, no longer in power, but still present. One of them approached Ethan awkwardly. "There's talk about forming a new advisory group, something inclusive. Some of us thought you might lead it." Ethan shook his head with a smile. "Find someone who needs that stage more than I do. But I'll support it." Not long after, Lila was invited to say a few words. She turned her wheelchair toward the small crowd gathered in the yard and spoke without notes. "This ramp didn't just help me get outside, it helped bring everyone closer," she said. "It gave me a way to be seen, not hidden, and it gave all of you a chance to show what kind of neighbors you really are." The yard was quiet for a moment. Then applause broke out, small at first, then steady and rising. Ethan stood back, watching, his hands in his coat pockets, heart full in a way that felt almost too big for his chest. As people moved into position for a group photo under the Freedom Rises Here banner, Ethan turned to head inside, but Mrs. Jacobs touched his arm gently. In her other hand, she held a small American flag on a wooden stick. She placed it into the flower pot beside the porch step, tucking the soil around it with care. "For your fight," she says softly. On a morning meant for gratitude, the ramp that once drew silence now echoed with laughter and community. What began as a quiet act of necessity became the cornerstone of a neighborhood's awakening. Sometimes justice isn't loud, it's steady, like a hand on a wheel, or a voice speaking truth with calm conviction. True change doesn't come from winning arguments, but from opening doors others tried to keep closed. And just like that, on a street once marked by lines and rules, something softer took root, where neighbors no longer looked away, but walked side by side.